we have heard from our representatives. We've heard from Paul also. We've had a number of important points, I think, that have been made that might lead into discussion. Robbie was talking about the need for people to participate in the design and change. Paul talked about the importance of data, why poverty is happening, changing policy, changing minds. Claire talked about changing systems and why systems lead into poverty. We need to look at systems, and that there is not an anti-poverty strategy in the Assembly. Ronan raised a point about poverty is a political choice. And again, he emphasized data, that stats and data tell a story. And Kate talked about people need to have a say. That's a similar point to what was made earlier, I think, as well. There were other points that each of you made, and it's now an opportunity for those of you who have been listening to come back with questions, maybe of clarification, with your own questions to probe a little further, and maybe observations or comments that you want to make in relation to what you've heard from our speakers. Our thanks again to Bobby, to Paul, to Claire, to Ronan and Kate. So over to the audience, and please don't hesitate. Let's have a conversation between now and about 10 to 9.
You need to unmute your microphone before you speak.
Okay.
Mary McManus wants to say.
Go ahead.
Okay. My name is Mary McManus, and I've worked for the last over 20 years in the advice sector. And Paul, it was great to hear from you. I wasn't at the last meeting, but I listened to your talk, and I've read one of your previous reports, and it was really nice. It's really good to see you and to have heard from you. I'm actually going to say we don't have a poverty problem. We have a wealth problem. There actually is enough wealth. It's just not shared and distributed. And there isn't a silver bullet, but there are some solutions that we could try, and we need to be doing it. And after over 20 years of looking at this and being so dismayed since 2010, and looking at our broken social security system and our economy that doesn't provide for everybody, I've now turned my attention to looking at community wealth building as something that I believe can actually make a difference. And as Ronan says, we have a lot of public institutions in Northern Ireland. They've got a huge amount of procurement power. And we're talking about not just the government, we're talking about our local councils, we're talking about our universities, our health trusts, huge procurement potential. Why are they, that's the sort of wealth I'm talking about. Why are they not procuring in such a way that supports the local economy, that keeps the wealth circulating? And also why, I actually presented today to the groups that are involved in the design and the anti-poverty strategy, the co-design group. And actually Julianne Maney spoke, Kate, at that. And that was a hard thing to listen to. And I have such respect for her and her compassion and her expertise. And she said that as a child, you're twice as likely to die if you're poor than if you're from a rich background. So I often ask myself, why is there not the urgency? Like when the food bank started appearing in Belfast, why did people not jump up and down? Why did Belfast City Council, why does the Assembly still not know how many people need food parcels? And to me, it seems, I did some research on community wealth building as part of a master's at Queen's last year. And I looked at why Belfast City Council didn't adopt the strategy when they had been looking at it at the same time as Preston. And now we have a Preston model. And what I found when I talked to the leader of Preston Council and the leader of North Ayrshire, where they're practicing this approach, I found people who had a huge amount of urgency about dealing with poverty and didn't think that it was impossible to deal with. They were actually trying something, do you know? So I really do think that the problem is not poverty, the problem is wealth. The problem is urgency and the lack of it about dealing with this. I was thinking to myself today after Julianne Maney spoke, you know, about the awful poverty as a paediatrician that she sees in the Royal. And I thought, and then somebody also said about an incremental approach, and that in this country, that if you want to get something done, and if you try to do it too fast, you will get a no. And I thought about in the 80s when we had the pictures from Ethiopia on our screens of the starving children, and nobody said, let's take an incremental approach to that. So why would we take an incremental approach to poverty here? So I do think there's something that we can do. And I suppose I would put it to the political reps here. You know, you can come up with strategies all you like, but it's actually the action that flows out of it. Because maybe, you know what, I might be, I'm sorry if some of you aren't aware of what I'm talking about, but you see Preston, who implemented this strategy and have became the most improved city in 2018, paying the real living wage, really trying to improve circumstances for their the people who live there. They actually didn't have a strategy. When I went to look for their strategy to compare it to Belfast, they didn't actually have one. They just did it. So I suppose that's what I would say is there are strategies out there. There are ways of dealing with this out there. It's just that we need a bit more urgency.
Okay, Mary, thank you very much. I don't know if anybody of our political representative panel or Paul wants to respond to that. Why no urgency?
Kate wanted to speak.
Yeah, Mary, thanks so much for raising that. You're completely right. And actually, it's something that is now starting to be discussed in earnest. I sit on the South Belfast Partnership Board, and we actually had a presentation on community wealth building a couple of months ago. Council is having a presentation, I think next Tuesday, with our community planning powers and that partnership. We're starting to actually look at it, but you're right, it's delayed. I posted the link to a blog post, but that in the chat. But that website has a lot of information on what community wealth building is, and it's very linked to what Paul's report had said. You know, when we're looking at the common good and wealth and who earns it and who benefits from it and where it goes, I think that website has a lot of really important information, and it's something that we can't just discuss as something academic and of interest. It's something that we have to pursue and make a reality within council, and hopefully that's something we're starting to do now.
Kate, thank you. Any other members of the panel wish to comment?
I suppose just again to agree with Mary and Kate, and actually I take some hope from the council, and the council was elected in 2019. There is a change. I mean, there's still a lot of the kind of same old in terms of the issues on discussion, but I think there are a lot of councillors in every party that are quite genuine about different approaches, and things like the press model, which is essentially Keynesianism and localism, and I think both of those are very in vogue at the moment in policymakers, so it's a good opportunity. But there have been some wins, and I know it's a few years since I've been on council. I know I got the living wage through in 2013, which is a long time that we've been talking about these things, and a prohibition on council using 0 hours contracts in 2015. And I know around that time the council, while it wasn't again systemic, I don't know that it was a kind of a procurement rule, but in that big investment package that the council did from about 2016 to 2019, there were at least social clauses in procurement around using social enterprises where possible, placements for long-term unemployed. But I appreciate it's piecemeal. It was kind of tacked on a wee clause, and it is about finding, and I agree with you about incrementalism, but it is also about doing the things you can do with the levers that you have. And again, I know I put a motion a few years ago about changing procurement models. It was a Christian Aid proposal about screening out those involved in tax avoidance. So I completely agree that it all feels like, a nip and a tuck here, but it is about it is about elected representatives at whatever level they serve, as well as community representatives doing the things they can do. But it's about getting buy-in for those models at the higher level. But I do see reasons for hope in council, not least the councillors we have here, but I think across all the parties that just are thinking about these in a new way.
Claire, thank you.
If I could just say, sorry,
Paul, go on.
Yeah, just that the Preston model is really interesting. One of the things that it had at the heart of it was a group that was firmly embedded in the community, that probably the reason you don't see a strategy is because it didn't come from a strategy imposed from above. It came from a movement that sat on the ground. And one of the dangers that you see as one model works in one place, people come along and look at how they do it, and then they try to export it without realizing that one of the key things was it grew from the bottom. So it'd be great, that strategy would be great, but it has to smell of Belfast for it to work in Belfast. It has to have grown in Belfast for it to work in Belfast. And from London, I'd love to smell of Belfast. That's another matter.
But you know what, and I'm sorry, I'll let other people in, but Paul, Belfast did look at this prior to Preston. They just didn't take any action. And what happened in Preston, you had great buy-in from the public sector organisations. But just to say to you all, it has been replicated. It's not the same, and Paul's right, it's a place-based approach, but there are numerous areas across the UK doing this. And actually the Minister for Communities has committed to the approach. So there is a bit of hope that way. But yeah, I mean, yeah, action, please, action on this.
Can I come in there, guys, if you don't mind? I know this, Mary, and quite rightly you asked this from the Belfast perspective, and I understand why. And just towards Belfast Council, obviously I sit in the Assembly, so obviously poverty is a wider issue, and it's quite prevalent in areas of Belfast. But one of the issues I see is in areas like, I come from Lisburn, and Lisburn is on average a more affluent area. However, poverty is the same level of poverty exists, and in fact the gap is even worse in areas where it's more affluent. So I'll use my own personal example, a bit like Kate there. I grew up in a family in Lisburn, a reasonably big family, almost to 5 kids. My mum and dad didn't work. I grew up in the 70s and in the 80s. I can remember supplementary benefit. I can remember going to the post office with little books to get £37.38 or whatever it was, every penny being counted, and what poverty felt like, and free school dinner tickets. And we talked about the stigma earlier on, and that stigma hasn't really changed. But I think to tackle this issue properly in Northern Ireland, you talked about a place-based approach. That's so prevalent here in Northern Ireland, because it isn't just the financial and fiscal bit, it's the environment too. And what I mean by that is my dad's family are from West Belfast, and the family size and structure was exactly the same. The amount of money that was going in to the family was exactly the same at those times, but some of the outcomes are slightly different because of the environment too. So that's why the approach needs to be, and I think you've already addressed this, to be fair, from Paul's answer. The Preston, and I don't know what it is, but it sounds pretty good. But what we said at the start in terms of the people feeding into it need to be the people that are affected by it, that can design it and know exactly what it looks like. But we already have some elements of success, whilst it wasn't necessarily to tackle poverty. I know that the SIF fund gets a hammer at times because some of it has been really badly used. I see you gasping there, Mary, but if you hear me out, in Lisburn there's Resurgam, okay? Resurgam is and I know Resurgam because you have Old Warren Housing Estate, and I grew up in Lisburn. I know what Old Warren Housing Estate felt like and looked like and was like to live in 20 years ago. It was fit to be bulldozed. But regardless of how you look at it, when people were invested in and people got a bit of design opportunity, and if you went into Old Warren now to see what happens in probably the most socially deprived area of Lisburn, if you like, it is now possibly the most vibrant. And what they have is it's ownership. People have ownership of it, and when you own something like that and you feel party to it, you're more inclined to make it work, as opposed to getting that hand. And I don't think we're disagreeing on this. I just want to emphasise that. strategy for developing these is really important, as opposed to just, I know it was Ronan that said it's a government implied thing. Government have a role to play, they certainly do, but they don't own it. Society owns this as well, and they should be the designers of it. Government certainly could be the facilitators and those that legislate for it. So,
Robbie, thank you. Maybe we can see if there's another question from the audience or another observation that someone wishes to make.
I was wondering, does socialism, how does socialism tackle poverty? Does it tackle poverty in a better way than capitalism?
That's a question about socialism tackling poverty maybe in a better way than capitalism. Anybody want to pick that up from the political panel?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Yeah, I suppose it's the difference between capitalism is, without getting too boring, it's leaving it to the market. It's basically saying, oh, well, sure, look, it'll provide for people, you know, people can buy stuff, and if they need stuff cheaper, they can get it cheaper, and that there'll be work available for people. And I suppose socialism in its various different forms, and obviously it's a very broad spectrum of opinion and approaches, but it's I suppose rooted in the concept of solidarity and you know, seeking to ensure that people aren't left behind, and, as I say, intervention. It's basically intervening in the markets to ensure people aren't kind of swallowed up by the system, because we know that on a global level, in terms of all the poor outcomes for the environment and for people in extreme poverty around the world, and just the just eye-watering and gross income gaps, you know, kind of at community level and national level and international level, those are a product of capitalism and largely unchecked capitalism. And I suppose socialism is a different approach. I say this as a social democrat or a democratic socialist, depending on kind of how I'm feeling at the time. But I suppose there's different approaches. Say, I feel strongly that you find ways to reward enterprise and input and innovation and all those things as well. And I suppose that's not as prevalent in other people's models. But capitalism, quite clearly, it isn't working. Yes, there can be winners from it, but it can be like a lottery. You know, you can just get lucky breaks, or you can be in the right place and get, you know, be at the right school or whatever. But I think most of the time we find the real, you know, the winners in life are people who started from a decent place, as in who had good opportunities in education or in home or community. Rags to riches stories are exciting because they're actually quite rare.
I think
Okay.
Peter Rollins wanted to speak, I think, earlier.
I think David Campton's also in the line somewhere. If we could take Pete and then David, or if there's a response that any of the political representatives wish to that socialist capitalist question.
Johnson, it's Ronan. I will come in and just, and thanks Emma Jane for a question. I suppose probably in the group I'll probably be one of them pesky socialists within the group. So I do believe in sort of massive state intervention, and I suppose that's where kind of me and you heard the tail end of Robbie's discussion, where me and him slightly disagree. Of course, I agree that co-design and all these strategies is necessary, but the state needs to wield its power, and it needs to wield its power through its economic approach. So what Mary was talking about in terms of, and what the tail end of my discussion was about, that social value procurement, so harnessing the power of government procurement, because these sort of capitalist entities aren't going to change unless we force them to change. And how you actually force them to change is you actually change the way that they try to get the services in which they endure their profit from. So that means the ending, and Claire said it earlier, that means the ending of 0 hours contracts. And I remember having a discussion with just one of the council officers in Belfast City Council, and he told me how great 0 hours contracts was. And I said to him, listen, you're on 60, 70, 80 thousand pound a year. Everyone I hear about telling me the benefits of 0 hours contracts is never anyone on a 0 hours contract. It's always someone on a secure contract. So we need to harness that social value procurement, but we also need to encourage the likes of cooperative businesses within Belfast and within the wider north. So cooperatives are businesses owned by its own employees, and there are some successful models such as Belfast Cleaning Company and things like that, where in sectors where you do have precarious contracts, like hospitality. If you look at hospitality during the pandemic, you've seen its reaction to the pandemic. There was companies a week into the pandemic get rid of all their workers. That was their answer. Their thing was about their profit margin. And for all the football fans out there, and I'm certainly one of them, if you look at this whole notion of that European Super League, it was nothing to do with the fans. It was nothing to do with helping European football. It was all about the billionaires' bottom dollar because they wanted to earn more money. So for me, and being one of them pesky socialists, we do need to have massive state intervention. We need to encourage the growth of the likes of cooperatives and social enterprises, non-for-profit entities, and we need to harness the power of the government's wheel to make capitalist companies, big major capitalist companies, buy into an agenda which helps everyone. So you always hear about this notion that trickle-down economics. Trickle-down economics means, you know, the working class get the scraps of the table, and even there's another term, a rising tide floats all boats. But not everyone has a boat. Not everyone's, you know, someone might have a hole in their boat. I know what one of Dergy Hargreaves' favourite saying, so she'll thank me for saying that. But we need to look at strategies, particularly from the state, to make these companies change, and then to change the culture by encouraging the likes of social enterprises and cooperatives.
Roland, thank you. Maybe we could hear from Pete Rollins at this stage.
Okay, thank you, guys. I'm Peter Rollins, all the way from Ballymoney. I'm involved with Ballymoney Methodist Church. And just to say, I'm also involved with Ballymoney Food Bank, which we opened 7 years ago. Interesting that the first Methodist minister in Ballymoney in 1856, and I'll repeat that, in 1856, set up an assembly room where he gave people food and clothing. So 2021, we're still talking about poverty, yet 150 years ago, 160 years ago, in Ballymoney, there was a need for food and clothing. It's interesting that yesterday when we opened Ballymoney Food Bank to the public, we had 66 people who needed food from us. I'm going to repeat that number, 66. And we passed the 14,000 mark yesterday of people since we opened in 2014, which is absolutely staggering. So poverty, as you can appreciate, is not just Belfast-based or West Belfast-based or whatever, it's all over the place. It's interesting that yesterday, I think I'm right in saying, and I hope I should have slightly, Kate, you made a comment about people coming to your food bank are made to feel thankful. And my heart jumped because I thought to myself, goodness, I hope that nobody comes to Ballymoney Food Bank, that we've done them a good job, because basically people come to us and they're in dire need for help. We know food is a sticking plaster, but yesterday, and I wrote it down, we referred people yesterday for food with food, oil, electricity, debt, and we also helped people yesterday with information on benefits and jobs. So a food bank is not just a food area, it's all sorts. And I would just simply say to you guys who are in politics, I think it was Claire Hanna who said there is no anti-poverty strategy. And I could be crude and say, guys, get the finger out and get it sorted, because you guys are the boys that can do it. We are little pawns in a game. We do our best at ground level, but you guys are the people that can make it work. So over to you.
There you go, Pete. Thank you. I'm wondering if, and you may know about this or may not know about it, but you're quite right. There is political responsibility. Your local council area. I mean, what is happening there? Do you know? Is there
I would have to say that Causeway Coast and Glens Council, I would take my hat off to them. In the past number of months, they've come up with a number of schemes, not only to help food banks, but to help organisations like St. Vincent de Paul, Salvation Army, Christians Against Poverty, Meals on Wheels. Tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, I'm on an anti-poverty meeting with Causeway Coast and Glens Council from 10 o'clock to 11:30. And they've brought all the organisations together to work closely together to help each other. And we work together as a massive team. I don't know whether that's same in other areas of Northern Ireland, but this anti-poverty group, we meet twice a month, and we're getting support financially as well, and we're also getting support out of it from local shops and things like that, like Tesco and Lidl, through the local council, who have worked superbly well with us. So hats off to them.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks for reminding us of the world outside Belfast. David Campton.
I want to thank all the participants so far tonight. It's been encouraging to have this engagement. But I have to say that earlier on, Mary, your reference to the Ethiopian crisis raised with me one of my bet, and actually it goes hand in hand with the food bank thing, in that the emotive, immediate response that we have to crises like that. It's great to have that response, and I won't quote Bob Geldof at this point, but simply getting food or money to the point of need at a point like that, yes, it's important, but it's the infrastructural and the fundamental structural issues that need to get addressed in the long term. And there was, I've forgotten the name of the author, and I know him, but a community development practitioner in Atlanta who wrote a book, it must be about 8-9 years ago now, referring to toxic charity, which is a well-documented phenomenon in the developing world, and sadly can be a recognized phenomenon in our world, where the need is being addressed on a prescriptive level, but is not being addressed on a fundamental level. And what was being said earlier about grassroots community development approaches, one of our problems in Northern Ireland is that there have been a number of really good local community development initiatives, but our social divides and the lack of a strategic approach at in government, initially because it was being run from London, which frankly didn't give a monkeys. In more recent years, because of the fractured nature of the executive and the silo-based nature of some of the departments, because as Robbie has already said, health and education are fundamentally linked to issues of poverty, yet we do not necessarily get a joined up approach in addressing these because of the silo-based nature of our assembly and executive. But it's also that lack of joined up level at the assembly is also matched, sadly, at a community level, where if you go back to the terms that were in favor probably, cranky, it's probably 15-20 years ago now, in terms of social capital, that we have lots of that inward looking local capital, but we have very, very little of the linking capital that joins local groups together. There were moves to do that in the early years of the Department of Social Development and the VCU, and a major mapping exercise was developed, and then it was all overturned with the collapse of the VCU and the development of the Department of Communities. An entire mapping exercise on food banks, because of food banks, was thrown out, did not get completed. So there needs to be two levels, both a more joined up approach at a government level, but also we need to start linking very, very good local projects together. And I have to say, Department of Communities throughout COVID has been brilliant at that, and hats off to the Minister and the team in the Department of Communities at that. They have been superb. I represent now a larger voluntary organisation. We were objecting a little, but the effort went where it should have gone, which was at that local community level, and hats off to them for that.
Thanks, David. Issues there about addressing structural issues in the long term and a lack of a joined-up approach, both in politics and in community. And if the panel wish to respond to that.
Could I just ask a question of Peter? Peter, you're the minister up in Ballymoney, are you?
No.
No, you
No.
belong to the church up there, don't you?
I'm Society Steward in Ballymoney Methodist.
Society Steward, okay. Well, here, the thing for me and you, probably, and any other of the believers on here, you'll know that the Bible says that poverty will always be with us. So we'll be constantly chipping at this, unfortunately, if the Bible is true. What we need to do is obviously not accept that as, we have to accept God's word, but we have to not accept it in its literal sense, and strive to tackle it in the manner that we should be tackling it, especially if we're followers of Jesus, which I would hope that people would see in me. But your input was marvelous, actually, and I think it is. Although it says that, it's something that we need to. I don't want to get all preachy, but I think of on the Mount, you know, and when Jesus commanded people, and he says, "What are you going to do? You have to look after the poor and clothe the naked, look after the prisoners, and all of those things." But it was asked we all were asked the question as to why it's not the priority. It absolutely is a priority for, I would say, every party, genuinely, and no party politicking here. I mean, we just came back from a 3-year abeyance, and at that stage, when we did the new decade, new approach, we looked at the issues, and the reality is, guys, we have a number of crises here to deal with in Northern Ireland, and then COVID happened as well. But poverty is interlinked into every strategy that's being done at the moment. You know, there's educational underachievement, there's the educational transformation, there's the mental health strategy, there's the suicide prevention strategy, there's as has already been talked about, the children's poverty strategy, the poverty strategies. Here's the important thing: they're all interlinked. They are all interlinked, and they all need to talk to each other. So see that cross-departmental working? You see if that doesn't happen? And cross-departmental working is almost as hard as it is for the big parties to get on up, and the executive sometimes. So there needs to be a maturity there, and the same people talking in those conversations to make sure we find out what those synergies and efficiencies are, make sure work's not being duplicated. And any savings or efficiencies that are made are turned into actually sort of fiscal powers transformed onto the ground. But I hope you didn't mind me just bringing that up about what the word also says to us, Peter.
No, absolutely fine. Well, just to say, we would have in Ballymoney Food Bank, we have a group of about 15 volunteers. 5 of the volunteers now are people who were once clients to us, who have come back in to help people. And that is just, I mean, when people say to me, what do you deem to be success? It's not with giving food to 14,000 people. It's the fact that, you know, people who are like, we see people improving their lives and improving their background, improving a thing. And that's success. You know,
Yes.
simple as.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Robbie. Any other comment from the panel in relation to the points about lack of joined-up approach, or the need for joined-up approach, joining the dots, whatever?
Johnson, sorry. Go ahead, Clerk.
Go on ahead, Ronan. No, I haven't shut up all night. I'll go in. I'll go after it. Yeah.
No, and I actually think David raised a fairly very significant point, and actually there was to be fair, Stephen Agnew, I think it was one of the previous assembly terms, probably the assembly term 2010 to 2015, he launched the children's bill, and that children's bill specifically was trying to address what you're talking about, David. It was the lack of actual cross-departmental working together in relation to children and poverty and educational underachievement. So the Department of Education was looking at a silo simply about education, you know, Department of Health, yet again, its own unique silo, and so on and so forth. But Stephen Agnew's bill from the Green Party at the time literally made it law that those departments had to talk to each other when it came to that field. So if it needs that sort of legislation, then I do believe that we need to look at that. And I think something frustrating for all elected reps here, and I know Kate sits in a number of just Belfast City Council committees with me, like when DFC and then Department for Economy were made, DFC has a responsibility for employability, and they've just launched a new scheme called Employability NI, which is all about focused, localized, co-design to try and get the productivity levels, to get the unemployment rate down, etc. But the Department for Economy holds the portfolio in terms of skills. So you would have thought skills and economy should come together, but one's at one department and others at another department. So it's certainly frustrating for, I would say, all elected reps, probably particularly for our assembly colleagues that are on here, but it's up to our job, and this is where the executive office need to come in, because the executive office should be that department that's all encompassing, looking after the numerous strategies that the executive and the assembly decide. But if them mechanisms aren't working, then we need to be open and honest about that and have that conversation. And as I said, if it requires legislation similar to Stephen Agnew's, then let's do it. And I do believe all the other parties would be willing for that.
Thanks, Roland. We could take probably one other question maybe from participants, if there is one.
Johnson, could I just ask a quick question?
Stephen, yeah.
While listening to everything that's been said, it's all good stuff, but if we really want to eliminate poverty and do it in reasonable time frame, do we not need something a bit more radical? Now, we had a speaker in South Belfast who talked about a minimum salary, okay, a minimum salary. So regardless of whether you're unemployed or in work, it will be topped up to a minimum salary. So everybody has dignity. Everyone has the income that they can afford to feed their families and live. That would take a lot of political will, but in the end of the day, it could eliminate poverty. So while everything we've been talking about is good, surely the time has come for something radical. Let's be serious about this, and let's get a groundswell of opinion to stop poverty, and let's do it.
Can I come in on that? And I'll give you sorry to cut over you. So, and I see Tony Weeks had asked, and Kate is saying, kind of another idea of the moment. It's been around for a while, is the universal basic income, which again is, could be a solution. I'll be really honest, and I've supported it in Parliament, and I'm on an all-party working group. I'll give you an illustrative example. An MP for a Scottish town just south of Scotland asked Boris Johnson about it today, and he mentioned the Belfast City Council motion and 20 other councils who've asked to take part in a pilot. And literally Boris Johnson replied and said, "Oh, I can't believe you're talking about a UK-wide initiative because you're a nationalist," and literally did not say one single thing about the UBI. So there isn't always the buy-in. Personally, I have a degree of reticence about it because of the government that we have, because I fear that it will be used as a reason to not do other interventions, and a reason to not do, like, for example, oh, you don't need free school meals anymore, sure, just take it out of your basic income. Oh, we're not going to fund this project anymore, sure, don't you get your £800 a month? So under the current government, I have some concerns about it, and I think the way to try it and pilot it is going to be sectoral, like look at either geographical areas. But just to pick up on a couple of other things, and David's comments rang through my professional background. I worked for Concern for 10 years. So you see the difference between strategic, there's that word again, long-term poverty alleviation and resilience building, and kind of wham bam toxic charity, and I've been in emergency zones where you can see the difference between, people I remember in Concern, you'd have an earthquake in Haiti and people would be arriving at the office with bags of clothes, like high heels and stuff, and you're going, what, how do you think I'm going to apply this remedy? And I think without a strategy, that is some of what happened. For example, really good stuff happened in the pandemic, but there was, as Kate said, a real glut of food-based responses, and a lot of us who are working with community sector will be aware of scenarios where people were saying, no, I've got like 5 boxes of super noodles in the kitchen, and it's not addressing the things that I need. So that's why you need strategy. And I see Tony's other comment there, and he's right, says that Belfast used to launch ships and now it launches strategies. But the fact is that you have to tie the different interventions together, and it links into your comment about why haven't we done these things. A big part of it is a lack of instability. I was doing a discussion yesterday on a very minor private members bill, but a good thing that Chris Little from the Alliance is doing. It's about changes in fair employment law. And as the conversation evolved, we realized that every party agreed. We were like, well, why hasn't it happened? And the reason it hasn't happened is because the Assembly has been down more days than it has been up. So, you know, when it's down for years, that everyday interventions don't get done. So political stability is the core. You know, we're going to hear more and more over the next year. We don't have time in this mandate to do this because for 3 years we didn't do anything. So, you know, you kind of have to, you know, you have to take a strategic and systemic approach, but you need political stability to do all these things, or else it's just, you know, short-term wham bam initiatives and people trying their best to stitch them together.
Claire, thank you. We're coming towards the end, I think, of the evening, and a fascinating discussion, wide-ranging and covering a lot of things. One of the things we said we would do in the last 5 minutes or so is to give each of our political representatives roughly a minute each for one sort of final comment in the evening. I think Robbie has had to go. I saw something go through the chat line. So maybe we go alphabetically again, minus Robbie, and a minute to offer your final thought, not your final thoughts, but a sort of thought at the end of this evening that might sum up what you feel the discussion has been about so far. Could we go to Paul? Are you ready to come in on this one as well?
Yeah, just very, very quickly, two things, and kind of in response to what the last couple of questions is. One, this idea that Trussell Trust is going to give out well over 2 million parcels this year, which is frankly a disgrace. It is terrible. And the trust itself has been on a journey, and the journey is from trying to see hunger and meet it to deciding actually that's not what we should be doing. What we should be doing is trying to prevent hunger and meeting what escapes and gets past that. And I think the last thing, which I think is going to be less popular, but I feel I should probably say it, and I'm not going for any votes, so I'm allowed to, which is that UBI, like all really simple solutions, has a lot of problems with it baked within it. When you model it, you find that any reasonable level of UBI actually creates poverty, and that increases the level of poverty over universal credit. So, and that largely that's because things like you have to start means testing housing benefits, so you can't get rid of means testing because a UBI in London, where rents are £1,200 a week, as opposed to somewhere else, which is £100 a week, you can't give a UBI that covers both of those, so you have to have a separate housing benefit system, and suddenly all the advantages of simplification go away. So while I just caution against simple answers, it's the difficult answers that are ground into the community and which guarantee reasonable incomes in multiple circumstances are probably the way to go.
Well, thank you. Claire?
No, just thanks. Really, really interesting conversation. I think that the bottom line is these things are achievable, and we don't have to just accept it. Yes, we've got constraints in terms of we don't have the levers. You know, the Northern Ireland Executive, even if the will was there, doesn't have the resources to, for example, put in a UBI, but there are many, many things we can do, but it has to be focused. We have to decide that these are our priorities, and our priorities aren't, you know, as I say, identity-based issues important, though they are, and just that kind of sense that there is something worth sticking around for is going to do so much for mental ill health and for community cohesion and all the other things that are going to dog us. But thanks for having us and for really stimulating evening.
Thank you, Claire. Ronan?
Thank you, and like Claire, I've really enjoyed the discussion, and I think between us all as political reps, what you've actually found is that there's a lot of commonality in what we are trying to say. I suppose I'm going to dedicate probably the last 50 seconds of what I have to say to agree with Paul, and in terms of UBI, I do believe it's a fairly simple solution. It doesn't deliver the targeted interventions actually which are needed, and that's where my point in terms of trying to address the objective need that's out there. And the likes of, you've seen the likes of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation come out against the UBI because it is a very simplistic answer to a very complex issue. And lastly, what I would say on it is that a UBI, like most things, and even the likes when Labour launched tax credits, a UBI allows big business to get away with paying poor wages. So what we actually need to do is to get business to pay good wages, and to see if your business can pay your employees a decent living wage to allow them to actually live in a property, have food, electricity, coal, gas, anything that they need. Then it's not a business that can survive, because your employees have to rely out and hands out from the state for your business to continue. So we need to fundamentally look at the private sector and legislate for the likes of a real living wage.
Roland, thank you. And Kate.
Thank you. I just wanted to pick up on one of the points about food banks, and Peter had been talking about it, and what Peter and others involved in food banks are doing are providing essential services that they should not need to. The government should be providing that, and thank goodness they are. I think that there are, but it's up to politicians to make sure that that stops. There are practical steps in terms of the COVID uplift. That £20 increase in universal credit has been a lifeline for so many people. We need to make that permanent, with even £10 increase to child benefit. You know, there are a lot of practical things that can be done. I think the conversations around UBI are important. I think piloting it and seeing how we could make it work is important. I think that there's a need for more responsible politicians who don't drive away foreign direct investment, or so many of our young people that we've heavily invested in. And I think there is just a commitment, there needs to be a commitment from politicians to take this really seriously and look at the long-term problem, the long-term cause. Too often we're looking at the impact. And I think that is a role that you can do as well. Keep asking us what we're doing about poverty. Ask your MLAs what you're actually doing to meaningfully tackle poverty. Don't wait until we hear Julianne Maney on the radio and people then are pushed into action like I was. This is now my #1 policy issue, and I'm looking at how we do community development within Balmoral, because we realized that actually from the COVID helplines, the people who have been calling the most are people in Finicky, BT9 and BT10. Those are areas that you don't expect to see the levels of deprivation and issues that exist. So how we capacity build, how we make sure that where there isn't traditional community infrastructure like there is in some areas, how we're building that. And I think these conversations are a really important step towards that. And one final thing I'd say, if you haven't seen, it's doing the rounds on social media at the moment, but Michael D. Higgins's speech is excellent. And there's a line where he says, the test of your citizenship is the ability to participate in society without shame. And I think that is something we all need to remember, and that people need to be able to afford essentials, and they need to be able to afford essentials with dignity.
Thank you very much, Kate, and thanks to all. And Alan Kerr will say that much more formally in a moment or so. We've had wide-ranging discussions, covered a whole range of areas. We've had the emphasis on a need for political stability to be able to tackle all these things. Questions we've not looked at, which might be worth throwing out as we go away. Do we need a poverty commission in Northern Ireland? What about regional citizens assemblies and regional civic fora, or whatever we call them, so that people can participate in the democracy and participate in dealing with this issue, or tackling this issue of poverty and the educational deficit and all the other areas that we were talking about joining up. So you've sparked lots of discussion this evening, both the panel and those of you who have among participants have raised important and significant questions.